The first thing I saw was white cloth swaying against the dark branches of the old oak at the far edge of my north pasture. The wind had a bite to it that morning, cutting through my coat as I eased the wagon over uneven ground, the frost crunching under the wheels. At first I thought some traveler had lost laundry to the prairie wind, caught up in the tree like a ghost of summer. But the closer I got, the heavier my chest grew. That wasn't cloth twisting in the wind. It was a figure. A rope was tight at the throat, the feet dangling above the ground, the white robe shifting in the October gusts. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood at a crossroads where one choice could change everything. My name's Elias Cooper. I was born on this same spread of land my grandfather homesteaded after the war. Learned early that work didn't wait for a man's mood. Cattle needed tending, wheat needed planting, storms didn't care if your back ached. My wife Martha kept me tethered to the better parts of life. She read scripture by lamplight every night, reminded me that a man's worth was measured by the truth he kept and the kindness he gave. We lived plain, not poor, but with a frugality that meant nothing went to waste, every nail saved, every scrap of cloth patched into something useful. When Martha passed 3 years back, the house got quieter than I like to admit. I still did the chores, kept the stock fed, and the fences mended. But Sundays felt hollow without her voice beside me in the pew. The town, 15 miles off, was growing faster than I cared for railroad men, talking about new lines, speculators driving up the price of good grazing land, folks buying and selling with money that came easy and went the same way. Out here, the days were measured by sun and weather, not bank ledgers or court papers. Still, the prairie has a way of carrying news whether you want it or not. I'd heard whispers about unrest at the old monastery down in the river valley, 10 miles beyond the Cooper line. Folks said the new abbot had a hard hand, and not everyone there found the peace they'd come for. I'd never had cause to ride that far myself, until that morning when the frost was still heavy on the buffalo grass, and the sight in that oak tree stopped me cold. I pulled the team to a halt, the reins tight in my hands. The air felt stiller than it ought to, as though the prairie itself was holding its breath. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a lone crow called. I climbed down, boots crunching in the frozen earth, and stepped toward that tree, my eyes locked on the figure swaying there. And that's when I saw the sign hanging from her neck, crude red letters scrawled across rough wood. I could read them clear even from where I stood. I didn't yet know who she was, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't over. The sign's red letters caught what little light the cold morning gave, and the words fixed themselves in my mind. I stepped forward, the frost brittle under my boots, and saw the faintest rise and fall in her chest. The robe was no ordinary cloth. It was the habit of a nun. Her head hung forward, the rope pressing deep into the skin at her throat. I moved fast, then back to the wagon, pulling it close enough to stand on the bed and reach the knot. My pocket knife bit into the hemp until it gave way. She fell into my arms light as a child, her body trembling and cold through the layers of fabric. I carried her to the wagon and eased her down the boards, creaking under our weight. Her lips moved, but only broken fragments came out, something about God, a letter, and that they would find her. Her eyes were open but clouded with fear, darting from one shadow to the next, as though expecting someone to step out. I threw the reins forward and turned the team toward the house. The prairie wind followed us sharp enough to sting, but it was her shaking in my arms that stayed with me. Inside, I set her on the leather couch Martha had favored, its cushions worn smooth from years of use. The stove still held some heat from the morning fire, and I stoked it high, the dry wood snapping as flames caught. Her skin was pale, the rope burns an angry red around her neck. I fetched a dipper of water from the pump, but when I held it out, she flinched, curling in on herself. I set it on the table instead, giving her space. She was young, barely past girlhood, and under the harsh light from the window I could see where strands of brown hair had come loose from her veil. Her hands were clutched tight over something beneath her robes. It was more than a reflex. It was like she believed her life depended on holding it. I didn't press her. I pulled the quilt from Martha's old cedar chest and laid it over her shoulders. The scent of cedar and faint lavender rose from the cloth, a reminder of better days. It took time before she spoke. When she did, her voice was rough, each word carrying the weight of strain. She told me her name, Sister Margaret Hale, and then she said something I hadn't expected. She wasn't worthy of God's love anymore. Whatever had been done to her had convinced her of that. She repeated it, like she believed it, as sure as the sun rises in the east. Hours passed before her grip eased, and I caught sight of what she held, a folded paper with a seal I recognized from the monastery 10 miles down the valley. The crest of St. Benedict's was pressed into the wax. When she finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, her fingers slackened enough for me to glimpse words written in a careful hand. I saw only a few. Silence must be maintained, for the greater good of the church. The rest was hidden, but the unease in my chest deepened. By the time she stirred again, the sun had shifted, throwing long beams of gold across the floorboards. She sat up slowly, wincing as the burns pulled at her skin, and scanned the room like she was taking stock of every door and window. I poured coffee, setting a cup in front of her without a word. She studied it for a long moment before taking it, holding it in both hands for warmth. Her words came in a rush after that, as if she'd been holding them in too long. She told me about her arrival at the monastery, full of purpose and belief she was answering a higher call. She spoke of the gardens, the stone walls, and the quiet halls where she'd expected to spend her life in service. But behind that peaceful face, the monastery showed the world there was something rotten. While helping with the archives, she had found records, ledgers, receipts, bank papers that told a different story. Donations for the poor were being diverted into private accounts. Money for maintaining the chapel and feeding the hungry was spent on luxuries, fine carriages, imported wines, and trips that existed only on paper. She gathered what proof she could, believing the abbot would set things right once he knew. But when she laid the evidence before Father Benedict, his face hardened. He didn't deny it. Instead, he told her to hand over everything and swear to keep silent. He used her vows, her fear of eternal damnation, to try and bind her. When she refused, the punishment began. They locked her in her quarters, cut her off from the others, and made sure the whispers around the monastery painted her as unstable. Late at night, when the halls were empty, men would come to counsel her rough hands, leaving bruises on her arms. Through all of it, she kept that letter. It was her account of what she'd found, with copies of the damning documents tucked inside. It was the only shield she had left, and she meant to protect it with her life. As she finished speaking, her eyes moved to the window. Outside, the prairie was open and still. But I followed her gaze and saw it, the glint of sunlight on glass, the outline of a carriage cresting the rise far off. They were looking for her. The carriage on the far rise kept to the road for a moment before veering off the wheels, cutting a fresh line through the brittle grass. I let the curtain drop back over the window. Sister Margaret sat stiff on the couch, her hands tightening over the letter again. The fire popped in the stove, loud in the stillness between us. I told her to stay put and stepped outside. The air was dry enough to chap the lips, and the wind carried the faint squeak of axle grease. I crossed to the barn, keeping the house between me and the carriage's path. The team was already harnessed from earlier, and I led them out, hitching them to the wagon with quick, practiced hands. By the time I returned to the porch, the carriage had slowed, the figures inside barely visible in the dust they stirred up. Margaret stood in the doorway, now the quilt still draped over her shoulders. "We need to go," I said, keeping my voice low. She hesitated only a moment before stepping down onto the packed earth, her boots making a dull thud. I helped her up into the seat and climbed in beside her, setting the reins loose over the team. We left the yard by the North Trail, a narrow track that wound through cottonwoods and along the shallow creek bed. The sound of the wagon wheels over frozen ruts filled the first stretch of silence. Margaret kept her gaze fixed behind us. Once she asked if we were being followed. I told her I couldn't say yet, but this road would take us far from the main crossing where strangers might ask questions. We passed the old Miller place. Nothing but a collapsed roof and a stone chimney standing now, and the narrow bridge where the boards groaned under the weight of the wagon. When we reached the far ridge, I pulled the team to a stop and looked back. No dust cloud trailed us. If the carriage had come this way, it had turned off before the ridge. Still, I urged the horses on putting more ground between us and the valley. The trail dropped into open prairie again, the grass short and stiff with the first pale hints of winter showing in the draws. By mid-afternoon, the sun had shifted enough to throw shadows across the road. We stopped in the shelter of a cottonwood grove where a trickle of water still ran. I handed her a small sack from under the seat, biscuit jerky, and a tin of water. She ate in small bites, her eyes never staying in one place long. "They won't stop," she said finally. Her voice was quiet, but the words were certain. I asked her if anyone outside the monastery knew what she'd found. She shook her head. The men who came to her room had taken papers when they could, but they hadn't found the ones she'd hidden away with the letter. That was why she had kept it close, even while half-conscious in the tree. It was proof, and it was dangerous. We reached the county road as the last light was flattening over the horizon. A lone freight wagon rattled past, heading west, the driver tipping his hat without slowing. I turned east toward the larger towns where I knew no one by name. We could find a bed for the night and make arrangements for the rest of the trip under less watchful eyes. In the next town, the lamps were just being lit along the main street. The air smelled of wood smoke and horse sweat. I left Margaret in the wagon near the livery while I stepped into the telegraph office. The clerk, a lean man with ink on his fingers, didn't ask many questions after I paid for a message to be sent to Kansas City. I kept it brief, naming a time and place for a meeting. We took a room above the Mercantile, the kind with a thin door latch and a window that looked down over the alley. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, still wrapped in the quilt from my house. The lamplight showed the marks at her throat more clearly now, dark against her pale skin. I told her we would leave before dawn. She asked where we were going. I told her only that it was a place where someone would listen and that they could keep her safe long enough to act on what she knew. Her fingers traced the edge of the folded letter, and for the first time since I'd found her, she nodded without looking toward the door. Outside, the town quieted. A single rider passed under our window, the hoofbeats slow and deliberate. Margaret's eyes followed the sound until it faded. I checked the latch again, then doused the lamp. Morning would come soon enough, and with it, the next stretch of road. Before first light, we slipped out of town. The frost was thick on the wagon seat, the breath of the horses rising in pale clouds as we turned east along the narrow road. Sister Margaret sat close, the quilt still wrapped around her shoulders, the letter pressed to her chest. The street lamps behind us glowed faint in the distance until they vanished with the bend of the road. By mid-morning, the land stretched open again, bare of trees and full of winter's hush. I kept the team at a steady pace, following the ruts that led toward the main route north. Margaret didn't speak for some time, but when she did, her voice was steadier than I'd heard before. She asked what I knew about Kansas City. I told her only that it was the place where people with the right badges could act without asking permission from county men who owed favors to the wrong folks. She listened, then began telling more than she had in the safety of my home or the mercantile room. She spoke of the first weeks at the monastery, how the routine felt like purpose, the work like a calling. But soon she noticed entries in the ledgers that didn't match what she'd seen in the storerooms or the donations coming in. At first she thought it was carelessness. When she found entire months missing from the books, she realized it was no accident. The details came slower after that, her eyes fixed on the horizon as she spoke. She described slipping into the archives when others were at chapel making copies of the most damning records and hiding them away. She told me about the night Father Benedict summoned her, the papers still ink-wet in her hands. His voice was calm, but the words were cold. She was to surrender everything and swear silence before God. When she refused, the isolation began. The lock on her door, the bruises, the whispered threats that she'd be cast out in disgrace or worse. We stopped near a windmill to water the horses. The air there smelled faintly of iron from the pump. Margaret stayed in the wagon, her hands never leaving the letter. When I climbed back up, she asked if I believed anyone could help. I told her help wasn't what we were after. We needed someone who would act. By late afternoon, we reached the fork where the road widened into the main trail north. The ruts were deeper there, pressed by freight wagons and stagecoaches. We followed it until the lamps of a relay station came into view. Inside, the air was warm from a big iron stove, and the scent of boiled coffee filled the room. I paid the station man for 2 bowls of stew and a place to sit in the corner. Margaret kept her back to the wall eyes on the door each time it opened. While she ate, I stepped outside to send another wire, this one to confirm our arrival. The sun was setting fast, the sky the color of banked coals. A lone rider passed on the far side of the road, not looking our way, but I watched him until the dark took him from sight. We left the station under the cover of night, taking the last stretch to the city, with only the moon and the sound of the team's hooves for company. The closer we came, the more the air changed. Wood smoke mixing with the smell of coal fires, the faint clang of a rail yard somewhere ahead. Lights from the city flickered in the distance, spread wide like a field of low stars. It was near midnight when we rolled into the quieter end of town, the streets still cobbled but empty of most traffic. I led the team down an alley behind a brick building and tied them where the shadows were thick. Margaret followed me to a side door marked only with a number. A single knock brought it open, and a woman in a dark coat looked us over before stepping aside. Inside, the air was close and smelled faintly of paper and ink. The woman introduced herself as Agent Sarah Martinez. Her handshake was firm, her eyes sharper than most men I'd met. Without much ceremony, she asked Margaret to sit and begin from the start. I stayed by the door while Margaret told her story again, this time with the letter and copies of the records laid out on the table. Sarah read each page in silence, her expression tightening just enough to show she understood the weight of what she was holding. When she finished, she promised Margaret she wouldn't face this alone. The words were plain, but they carried a certainty I hadn't heard in a long while. We stayed there until the first gray of morning began to seep into the narrow windows. Sarah had more questions, and Margaret answered them all, her voice stronger with each one. By the time we left, the streets outside were stirring with early wagons, and the lamps were going dark. The city was awake now, and with it came the next step, one we both knew would set more than a few wheels in motion. Agent Martinez didn't waste words after Margaret finished speaking. She gathered the letter and records into a leather satchel, then slid it under her chair. "We'll move quickly," she said, her voice even. "You'll stay in the city until I'm certain we can get you out of reach." She sent a man in a wool coat and bowler hat to arrange lodging under another name. Margaret and I followed her through a side door into the cool morning air. The streets were stirring milk wagons rattling over the cobbles, a boy sweeping in front of a bakery. We walked 3 blocks to a narrow boarding house, where a gray-haired woman opened the door without a word, nodding once before showing us to a small room on the 2nd floor. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn tight. Once Margaret was settled, Martinez joined me in the hall. "There's more to this," she said. 2 former employees of the monastery tried to report wrongdoing months ago. Their complaints never made it past the county office. She explained that with Margaret's papers and testimony, The case now had weight enough for federal jurisdiction. It meant there was a path forward, but it also meant anyone connected to the monastery would realize what had been set in motion. I spent the rest of that day, between the boarding house and the federal office, answering questions from men who knew how to follow a paper trail. They worked with quiet focus, laying out bank slips, signed transfers, and ledgers on long tables. Margaret was in another room with Martinez, telling her story again for the record. When we crossed paths in the hall later, she looked pale but steady. That evening, Martinez walked us back to the boarding house. "Tomorrow we bring in a judge to sign the warrants," she said. "Once they're in hand, it'll move fast." She handed me a slip of paper with a time and address for the next morning. "Keep her inside tonight," she added. The night was long. Somewhere past midnight, I heard a carriage roll slowly down the street, the horse's shoes striking the cobbles in a steady rhythm. The sound faded, then came again an hour later. Margaret sat up in bed, each time listening until it was gone. Before dawn, we were on our way to the address Martinez had given. It was a brick building with a brass plate reading United States District Court. Inside, a clerk ushered us to a waiting room. Through the door, I caught glimpses of papers being signed and seals pressed into hot wax. By midday, Martinez returned her coat buttoned against the wind. "It's done," she said. "The orders are being served." We moved quickly after that. A wagon waited in the alley to take us back to the boarding house. But Martinez peeled away toward the marshal's office. She didn't say where she was going, but I had a good idea. Margaret stood at the window all afternoon, the quilt around her shoulders. Just before dusk, a rider passed by at a gallop heading west. She turned from the glass and asked, "When will we know?" I told her it would be soon, sooner than most would expect. The following morning, the boarding house hall smelled of coffee and wood smoke. A knock came at the door, and when I opened it, Agent Martinez stood there in a dark coat, her expression set. "It's time," she said. Margaret rose from the chair by the window, the quilt folded neatly over her arm, and tucked the letter into her satchel. We left without breakfast, stepping into the cold street where the light was still thin. The courthouse stood 2 blocks away, its stone steps wet from an early frost. Martinez led us inside past the clerk's counter and into a small chamber where a deputy marshal waited. He held a stack of papers, each bearing the seal I'd seen pressed the day before. "Warrants," Martinez said quietly. "They go out now." The marshal left with 2 men in uniform, their boots sounding heavy on the floorboards as they went. Margaret and I stayed with Martinez in a room that smelled of ink and damp wool. She explained that teams were already in place, one heading to the monastery, another to the judge's office in the county seat. The rest would serve orders to seize bank records in town. Outside the window, the city's noise was picking up wagon wheels over stone, the ring of a hammer from a smithy, voices carrying in the crisp air. An hour passed before the first messenger arrived, his breath showing in short bursts. "They've taken him," he said, passing Martinez a folded note. She read it, gave a single nod, and set it aside. "Father Benedict is in custody," she told Margaret. The words hung there, steady and final. Margaret's hands were tight in her lap, but she didn't speak. Not long after, another runner came with news from the county seat. Judge Harper had been removed from his chambers. By midday, the remaining warrants had been served. Martinez looked over the reports as they came in her fingers, leaving faint creases in the paper. "It will take time to untangle it all," she said. "But the net is closing." We left the courthouse in the early afternoon, the wind sharper now. Margaret walked beside me, her steps measured. At the boarding house, she went straight to the window again, as if half expecting to see the same carriage from before. Outside, the street was quiet except for a boy leading a mule past. Martinez joined us later, carrying a ledger and a packet of letters taken from the monastery. She didn't share the contents, only said they confirmed much of what Margaret had risked to bring forward. "You've done more than you know," she told her, then stood to leave. At the door, she paused. "Stay inside tonight. Tomorrow we'll talk about where you go next." The light was fading when I noticed a rider at the far end of the street. He slowed near the boarding house, scanning the row of windows before moving on. The sound of his horse's hooves lingered even after he turned the corner, and in the dim room, Margaret's eyes followed that sound until it was gone. By morning, the street outside the boarding house was thick with rumor. Two men talked in low tones near the livery, their eyes shifting toward the courthouse with each passing wagon. Margaret sat at the small table, her satchel closed, the quilt folded across her lap. A light knock came at the door, and Agent Martinez stepped inside, brushing the cold from her coat. "It's begun," she said simply. "The arrests are underway." She laid a folded sheet on the table. It held a short list of names, each one written in a steady hand. Margaret read them in silence, her eyes pausing at the first. Father Benedict. Below that was Judge Harper, then Brother Ansel, Brother Marcus, and a diocesan clerk named Samuel Keene. Martinez explained that all were in custody as of sunrise, with federal marshals holding them in separate locations. Bank ledgers, letters, and receipts had been seized from the monastery offices before word could spread. By mid-morning, the sound of boots and wagon wheels filled the street outside as more men were brought in. Through the curtained window, I caught sight of two marshals leading a shackled figure up the courthouse steps. His coat collar was turned high, but there was no mistaking the set of his shoulders. It was the judge. Martinez didn't look toward the window. "It will be in the papers by evening," she said. Margaret set the list down, her hands still. "And the money?" she asked. Martinez told her most of the accounts were frozen, with auditors from the capital arriving to track the rest. The funds would be held until a court decided how they were to be returned. "It won't be quick," she added, "but it will be done." That afternoon, Martinez brought word that the monastery itself was now under federal supervision. The remaining clergy had been moved elsewhere while the building was searched from cellar to belfry. Margaret listened without speaking, her gaze fixed on the cup of coffee cooling in front of her. When Martinez left, she rose and stood at the window again, watching the lengthening shadows across the street. Toward dusk, a light snow began to fall, dusting the rooftops and softening the sound of passing wagons. A rider appeared at the far end of the street, his coat dark against the white. He slowed as he neared the boarding house, scanning the windows before tipping his hat and continuing on. Margaret stepped back from the curtain. "It feels quieter," she said, though her voice carried the weight of caution more than relief. We lit the lamp as night came on the glass chimney, fogging slightly in the warm air. Outside, the courthouse bell struck the hour, its tone carrying clear through the cold. Inside, the room held the stillness of something long in motion, finally starting to settle, though we both knew there were more steps ahead before any of it could truly be called finished. Snow still clung to the rooftops the next morning, though the sun was bright enough to send thin lines of meltwater down the eaves. Margaret sat at the table, her hands folded over the satchel that had rarely left her side. Agent Martinez arrived just after breakfast, her boots carrying a light dusting of the street's frost. She closed the door behind her and said, "It's finished. They've been bound over for trial, and they won't be walking free before it's done." Margaret listened quietly as Martinez explained the arrangements. She would be taken west under a new name, to a convent in Colorado, where she could teach and live without looking over her shoulder. The funds stolen from the charities had been secured, and a federal monitor would see them returned to their rightful purpose. When Martinez stood to go, Margaret rose with her. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady now, not the broken whisper I'd first heard under that oak tree. By midday, the wagon was ready. The sky was clear, the cold softened by a light wind from the south. I rode with them as far as the city's edge, the sound of the team's hooves mixing with the creak of harness leather. When it was time to part, Margaret held out her hand. "You gave me a chance to breathe again," she said. I told her she'd done the hard part herself. She climbed into the wagon, the quilt folded neatly beside her, and they set off down the road, the wheels leaving crisp tracks in the thin snow. I turned my own horse toward home. The miles passed under a pale winter sun, the land wide and still. When I reached the ranch, the place looked just as I'd left it. Fence lines, straight smoke curling from the chimney, the oak tree standing at the far edge of the pasture. Only now it held no shadow in its branches. Weeks later, a letter arrived with no return address. The paper smelled faintly of lavender, and the handwriting was careful, but sure. Margaret wrote that the convent sat in the foothills, the air sharp and clean, the children eager to learn. She said she could feel the weight lifting little by little each day she worked. Some evenings I still stand on the porch as the sun drops low, painting the pasture in gold. The wind moves through the grass with the same quiet it's always had. But I hear it different now. Justice doesn't always ride in with a badge or a gavel. Sometimes it's just two people choosing not to look away when the world tells them to. If you've ever seen a moment where stepping forward made all the difference, I'd like to hear about it. And if this story stays with you, I hope you'll join me again for the next one.